Hey, to get the most out of this video, be sure to watch video 4.5a first on characteristics of all nutrient cycles. In this video, 4.5c, we'll dive into a deeper exploration of the nitrogen cycle. As you learned in video 4.5a, nitrogen is an atom found in two classes of macromolecules: proteins that have building blocks of amino acids and nucleic acids, which have the building blocks of nucleotides. There's nitrogen right there and right here in this nitrogenous base. Here's a simplified overview of the nitrogen cycle. In its abiotic form, nitrogen is found as N2, nitrogen gas, in the atmosphere. Nitrogen makes its way into the food web by many steps. First, bacteria transform nitrogen in many chemical reactions in the soil. Then plants take nitrogen in through their roots with water, and once inside of living things, nitrogen is an atom found in DNA, RNA, and proteins. Then nitrogen moves through the food web by organisms eating each other. And finally, nitrogen makes its way back into the atmosphere when decomposers break down dead things and waste through some chemical reactions that convert nitrogen back into N2 gas. Here's the nitrogen cycle represented as a diagram. You can start with the abiotic reservoir. One abiotic reservoir for nitrogen is the atmosphere, where nitrogen is found as nitrogen gas, N2. But the soil is also an abiotic reservoir for nitrogen. In the soil, nitrogen can be found as ammonium, nitrites, and nitrates. Okay, I know this is getting a little complicated, so let's rethink this diagram a little bit. All right, I want you to think of the nitrogen cycle as kind of like two different cycles. Let me explain. Think of cycle one as just involving soil bacteria and the atmosphere, represented by this loop. Atmosphere, soil bacteria, soil bacteria, soil bacteria, and back to the atmosphere. So you see the atmosphere, then nitrogen-fixing bacteria, then nitrifying bacteria, and then denitrifying bacteria. Lots of bacteria. Then the other loop involves our producer plants and consumers and detritivores. And then this nitrogen can keep on cycling back to the soil and in the food web. So you see that plants take up nitrates, NO3, from the soil, and then decomposers put ammonium, NH4, back into the soil. Nitrogen fixation is done by nitrogen-fixing bacteria in the soil. Thank God, with how difficult the nitrogen cycle is, that these bacteria have a really easy name. So what nitrogen-fixing bacteria do is take nitrogen gas from the atmosphere and from air spaces in the soil and convert that N2 gas into ammonium, NH4. The ammonium stays in the soil. Here's that process represented as a chemical equation. Nitrogen gas is converted to ammonium by nitrogen-fixing bacteria. Sticking with that outer cycle, the next bacteria involved are nitrifying bacteria, here and here. Nitrifying bacteria convert ammonium, NH4, into nitrates by nitrification, which involves two steps. The first step converts ammonium into nitrites, NO2. And these same bacteria then convert nitrites, NO2, into nitrates, NO3. All right, so you see that first step here, nitrifying bacteria converting ammonium into nitrates. And then here's that same type of bacteria doing the second step, converting nitrites into nitrates. Here's that two-step process represented as a chemical equation. Step one is ammonium being converted into nitrites. Step two is nitrites being converted into nitrates. Both steps are done by nitrifying bacteria. To complete this outer cycle of bacteria, now we get to the process of denitrification. Denitrification is done by denitrifying bacteria. During denitrification, denitrifying bacteria convert nitrates, NO3, back into nitrogen gas, N2, in the atmosphere. Here's that process as a chemical equation. Nitrates are converted into N2 gas by denitrifying bacteria. So we just went through this outer cycle of the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen-fixing bacteria bring N2 from the atmosphere and turn that into ammonium in the soil by nitrogen fixation. Nitrification converts ammonium into nitrites and then into nitrates. Finally, denitrification releases nitrogen back into the atmosphere by making N2 gas. So how does this outer nitrogen cycle connect to the inner nitrogen cycle? Let's check it out. Well, plants take in nitrogen in the form of nitrates. So this is the entry point for plants. When plants take in nitrates, this is assimilation, separate from the fixation that happened over here. Remember, bacteria fixed the nitrogen, then converted the nitrogen to nitrates. And now plants take the nitrates in through their roots. Nitrates actually dissolve in water, so when a plant takes in water, nitrates come along for the ride. And once inside the plants, nitrogen in nitrates is converted to become part of DNA, RNA, and proteins. Assimilation is different in consumers. Consumers don't have roots, so they can't take in nitrates through their roots. Instead, consumers eat plants or other consumers and use the nitrogen that's stored in other organisms. In other words, consumers digest the macromolecules of organisms they eat, then use the nutrients to rebuild macromolecules of their own. Release of nitrogen happens in a couple different ways, a couple different steps. The first way is release into the soil reservoir. When living things die or shed dead parts or leave waste in the soil, detritivores break down all of this stuff. All of that stuff together is called detritus. So detritivores do a process called ammonification. Ammonification breaks down macromolecules containing nitrogen into ammonium, NH4, and the ammonium is deposited into the soil. Here's that process as a chemical equation. Macromolecules in detritus are broken down by detritivores to make ammonium. This process is called ammonification. Nitrogen can be released from the soil back into the atmosphere when those bacteria take over. So these are steps that we've seen before. First, this ammonium is converted to nitrites by nitrifying bacteria. Then the nitrites are converted to nitrates by those same bacteria. Now, at this point, the nitrates can be taken back up by plants and go back into the food web, or denitrifying bacteria can convert the nitrates back into nitrogen gas that's put back into the atmosphere. There's one last special consideration with the nitrogen cycle, and that special consideration is Rhizobia. Rhizobia, spelled up here, are specialized bacteria that have a mutualistic relationship with certain plants, like legumes. Legume plants are plants like bean plants or pea plants. Anyway, here's how it works. Rhizobia live in clumps called root nodules in the roots of the plants, and Rhizobia do their job of fixing nitrogen and making nitrates for the plants. They make plants' life a little bit easier to get nitrogen, and in return, the plants do photosynthesis and send some of that good old glucose down to the Rhizobia to give the Rhizobia food and keep them alive. Here's an actual picture of root nodules that have Rhizobia. It looks kind of gross. All right, so let's recap this nitrogen cycle. The major reservoirs for the nitrogen cycle are the atmosphere and the soil as abiotic reservoirs, and then living things are the biotic reservoirs. In the atmosphere, that should say nitrogen. In the atmosphere, nitrogen is found as N2, and in the soil, nitrogen exists as ammonium, nitrites, and nitrate. In living things, nitrogen is found in the form of amino acids and nucleic acids. In the soil, nitrogen-fixing bacteria fix the nitrogen from N2 into ammonium, and then plants assimilate nitrogen by taking in nitrates through their roots with water. Consumers, on the other hand, assimilate nitrogen by eating plants and eating other consumers. Finally, there's the release. Living things release nitrogen in their wastes and dead parts. Detritivores take over, and through ammonification, turn the nitrogen back into ammonium in the soil. Then, bacteria can convert the ammonium back into nitrogen gas for the atmosphere.